This is our conversation series where we discuss important topics related to the small business M&A industry. I am the co-founder and CEO of Private Market Labs, and we are a new process designed to democratize the small business acquisitions process. So we match buyers with deals based on their acquisition criteria and put those opportunities right directly in front of people, right in their inboxes, right in the platform. And we have a ton of fun updates coming to the platform in the next week and a half, including a lot of brand new deal and intermediary data and some other fun features that I'm going to announce very, very soon in the next few days. If you are a fan of the podcast, or even if you're listening for the first time, you can help us out by subscribing to our channel on YouTube. We do stream this through YouTube, and YouTube is the medium that we use to stream through Search Funder. So if you subscribe, leave us a review, that is always extremely helpful. Give us a like on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcasts or see your content. Any feedback, 5-star review, likes, subscribes, all of that is extremely helpful. Today's guest is fantastic, and I am extremely excited because our guest is Tom Taulli. He is a serial entrepreneur. He has started BizEquity, which serves the small business M&A ecosystem, among other companies. He's also a serial author, including the complete M&A handbook. Tom and I have chatted about his experience in the past week and a half or so, and he's got some fantastic insights to share. So I know on our podcast you spend a lot of time focusing on buyers, but Tom will help us delve into the seller's mindset today. So thank you so much for being here. Really excited to have you.
Thanks very much for having me, and look forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. So let's get started with your most recent venture into the small business M&A universe, which is BizEquity. So that company provides valuations for small businesses. Can you talk a little bit about how creating a valuation for an SMB differs from a valuation for a larger company?
Yeah, definitely. For valuation is sometimes more art than science. There's a lot of numbers in the report, but what is underneath those numbers is a business, obviously, and a business can easily go away tomorrow, or it can just go through the roof. Who would have thought ChatGPT would have come out a year ago, and all of a sudden, this is, generative AI is the big thing. And if you happen to be a company in generative AI like Jasper, all of a sudden you're one of the hottest companies out there, and everyone wants to get a piece of you, and your valuation goes through the roof. So, in terms of the SMB and kind of like these smaller businesses, though, and what my background is that, um, you know, the, you have, ultimately evaluation is really about the future. It's about where you see this business going and about the profitability or the cash flows from that business. And then again, that's a little bit more art than science, because we're talking about predictions, and that doesn't always, these predictions don't always pan out. And especially the smaller the business, the riskier the business. So the chances of that business going under are a lot higher than it is for a much larger business. So usually you have a major discount when it comes to some of these smaller businesses because of that risk. And then also there are other factors involved, and that is, um, it's a private business. So if I go and buy the business, for me to go and sell that business is, how do I know I'm going to get a better price down the line? So you kind of discount it for that as well. And then you also discount it for the fact that a lot of times the small, I'm talking about real small businesses, are dependent upon the owner. That owner's vision, that owner's goodwill with the customers. If that owner leaves tomorrow, is that business even still relevant? Is that business still going to operate? Those customers may go elsewhere because they wanted that. These relationships are personal, and those customers may decide, I might go somewhere else, and not, or I may be concerned because that owner is not there anymore. So that's why a lot of times when you see these sales of businesses, the owner probably is going to stay on board for some period of time because of that. So, you know, the again, I think it's a lot of it is an art versus a science, and then it also comes down to negotiation, and so there's a lot of factors involved. But I think for the smaller businesses, you tend not to get the higher valuations generally because of the risks I've I've talked about. And as the businesses get more stable and more infrastructure, then those valuations and the multiples tend to increase on some type of chart. You see the multiples increases as the businesses get larger.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really helpful. And so it really sounds like it comes down to just generally small size. It comes down to illiquidity, and it comes down to owner risk, key man risk, or key
That's
person risk, I guess,
that's
in
right.
this particular case. And that's a really helpful framework to talk a little bit about, kind of the valuation process itself. So one thing that we see in the M&A space, and all the time, particularly you see on sell side advisor websites, or I know BizBuySell has one, for example. It's a calculator, and a valuation, like sort of quick valuation calculator. Like, what kind of inputs do you feel like are needed to put together a real actual viable valuation? Are these quick calculators worth anything? How much should we be discounting what we're getting from something like that versus something like a 50-page valuation book? I guess, how do we have a better sense of the differences between those things?
Yeah, I mean, if you had a valuation expert, and by the way, at BizEquity, we hired a couple of valuation experts to help us with this modeling. And if you had one of those experts who, there's certifications for these valuations that these experts get, you're going to get a pretty good valuation. No question about it. They're going to do interviews with the owner and maybe employees and of the company. They'll do research about the competition, about recent, uh, uh, transactions in that business, in that industry. So they'll do a lot of research, and that valuation is definitely gonna be better than a more of a do-it-yourself valuation on the internet. But that's not to say I would discount it either. Yeah, that DIY valuation is probably going to be in the ballpark.
Mm,
Um, and so, in terms of what you would want to have in there, is at a minimum, obviously, you want the financial. Most of it's going to be financial related, right? So, your revenues, your known as EBITDA, or your cash flow, and then also the calculate a really good calculator will make an adjustment for the owner's compensation. So, the owner a lot of times, maybe have an LLC, and the profits just flow to the owner, and the owner, uses that cash flow for personal expenses, and it really is more like compensation. So you want to factor out some of that to get a better idea of what the true cash flow is of the business. So a good calculator would recast the financials in a way to make it so it gives a better idea of what the cash flows are. Because when you have your own private business, there's a lot of things you can do personally that distort what. Yeah, I have a friend. He has a multi-million-dollar business, and it doesn't make any money. Well, because
right.
his wife is on payroll, his kids are on payroll. I don't think they do anything. It's just the way it is. But when that business is sold, those expenses won't be there anymore, and those expenses suddenly turn into profit. And so you need to make sure that that's put into the calculation. A really
Yeah.
good calculator, would bring in some industry information,
Mm,
or even better, recent transactions in the industry. And smaller businesses, geography matters too. So if you have a local car wash, you would prefer to have similar types of car washes in the vicinity that the business is being sold for those transaction comparables. So that would be an even better, uh, calculator. Um, Now the good thing is a lot of this stuff can be automated because it is
mm,
available online, and there are like BizEquity in different valuation software that can do that for you. And a lot of these, even back then, just like 15 years ago when I created BizEquity and I talked to these valuation experts, they had really sophisticated software programs that they would use to get access to those comparables and industry information to make a much better valuation. So those are the kinds of things I would look at. But I think the key here for those small businesses is recasting, that cash flow in a way to make it more realistic as to what this company is making versus what it
Yeah.
says it is.
No, that makes perfect sense. So you touched a little bit on, sort of how the seller is preparing for the sale. They're pulling, extraneous expenses out. Maybe those expenses are in there to minimize tax liability, and now they're, pulling the expenses out to show profit as they're trying to sell the company. We hear this story all the time, right? You've actually sold several businesses, so would love to touch on how that process was for you. Maybe you could help our audience, which is going to be mostly buyers,
Okay.
help them get into the mindset of a business owner exploring a potential sale. What are people thinking about? What are they worrying about?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think I was probably in my mid 20s when I sold a business, and I had obviously no experience in doing that. My experience was running and creating a business, and so when I sold it, it was a little bit overwhelming, and so I tried to, and I didn't have a broker or a financial advisor. I did have an attorney. I did have an attorney, but it was definitely a lot to take in, and it's a bit stressful, and it is your most for most sellers, it's your most important asset, and it's a little bit like your baby too, and sometimes the buyer is going to say things about your baby that you don't necessarily agree with, and
Right.
might think, well, they may call your baby kind of ugly, and it's like, well, I've been working 24/7 on this business, and how dare you, so sometimes there can be some easily some conflict in this process because the sellers put a lot of time and effort into this business. There's stress, and there's also kind of this unknown about, can I trust the buyer? Can I get a better deal? Or maybe I should still go it alone and go forward. And so there's a lot of things I think that go through the buyer's head. And so I think, and it can be a long process too. Usually it's not something that's done over the weekend. There's a lot of paperwork, it's escrow, there's due diligence. So there's a lot that's involved in the negotiation. So there's a lot. This process can go on for a little while, and for the buyer, where sometimes it can be a problem is that the process drags on, and then the buyer's spending. I mean, the seller and the owner is spending so much time trying to sell the company that the business starts to go downhill
Right.
because you're not really focusing on what's important. So it's a pretty common thing. So there's a lot that goes on in this process, and it's a bit of a scary thing, I think, for a lot of sellers.
So, what are some of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to selling a business? So, when you and I chatted, a week and a half ago, we talked about there are a few elements that you think people don't necessarily think about as much as they should be when they're considering selling a business. What are some of those factors? What are some things that our listeners should know that they probably don't know yet?
Some of this is, the stuff that is what owners really just don't like to think about. You know, you know, part of it is just, um, a lot of owners don't like to use service providers like accountants and
Mm,
attorneys, and they try to minimize those expenses. And then when it comes time to sell the business, the financials are a mess. The contracts are in some shoebox, and there's receipts all over the place, or you can't even find the receipts. And so you're just putting yourself in a position where your valuation starts going down because the buyer, although a good buyer, a savvy buyer understands, for these private companies, this is kind of the case, but they can use that against you and say, well, we're a little concerned that, your books are not in shape and you have these do, the financials, can we really trust them? So I think that, part of it is, the business owner is so focused on building the business, which is great, but they don't usually put enough time and some of these other things that they just think that just get in the way. The other thing I think that is overlooked or a misconception is corporate structure.
Mm,
And I ran into this early on, and this maybe is a little different nowadays, but I don't necessarily think so. Um, my original business was an LLC. That actually was difficult for a buyer
mm.
in the sale, and also caused some tax issues as well. So my I always think that go with a Delaware C corp every day, all the time, and then people, the buyer knows how to deal with those, and it just makes it so much simpler. So I think corporate structure is another, key thing. And I think I'm missing. There's another one I wanted to say. Now I can't remember what I was going to say. But I think it's a lot of it is has to do with certain things that the owner just doesn't pay a lot of attention to early on, and it becomes difficult later on when when you're selling the business to catch up. Um, so if you're going to sell your business, I recommend maybe doing some cleanup and preparation, bring an accountant in, make sure the books are, a lot better, like, attorney, make sure that the documents are ready to go. So it makes it a smoother process, and you'll stand out among the others that these buyers have seen, and that increases their confidence, and I think it makes it better for the transaction.
Right.
Makes it, so I do those are kinds of things, but like I said, the owner really just, which is what they should be doing, is getting customers, building product and services, and it's a lot of times they just don't want to deal with these kinds of issues.
Yeah. I think one thing that I've heard a little bit kind of as people have talked about this process, a little bit sort of how the structure of the deal impacts kind of what ends up in the owner's pocket and how that might
Yeah.
be something that the seller's not thinking about so much. So, whether that's from a tax perspective or an earnout perspective, maybe could you touch on that? Is that how do you sort of see those kinds of issues?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to bring up, taxes.
On the same page.
Um,
That's something we
the
definitely don't always want to be talking about. So as someone who just did my Q4 taxes and I'm now looking
yeah,
at the end of the year, I don't want to be thinking about taxes either. So I get
yeah,
it.
yeah, no. Um, you know, there are actually, there are ways, there's a type of corporate structure you can put in place when you form your company that can really, I mean, just pretty much virtually eliminate a lot of your capital gains
Mm,
taxes when you sell the business. Um, Reason why to get a tax advisor early on when you form your business, and a good attorney when you form your business, to find all the ways you can get these tax benefits. The other thing too is, the seller's going to get an education in taxes because the buyer is going to wants to find ways to minimize, and as much as possible create some type of tax-free transaction. Minimize the tax impact. So this is not to say you need to become a tax expert, but get prepared for learning about taxes when you sell the company. And also, I think, having that Delaware C corp also helps. Uh, but also, there's some other things you can do and put in place early on, but you can't do, later, and try to, you know do it retroactively. So yeah, taxes are just one of those things that are overlooked, but the buyers pay close attention to that. So, you know, you know, that's something where the sellers need to, think about and be proactive about. And so, yeah, I think so. Your two best advisors are really a lawyer and some type of accountant, tax
mm.
person. They will go a long way in they may cost you some money, but the amount you save over time is so much more than what you're going to pay.
Yeah.
So as long as
That
you have
makes
good
sense.
ones.
Yeah, of course. So from your experience, what makes a good buyer in the eyes of a seller? So we're always talking about, how do buyers stand out beyond, hey, I want to preserve your legacy. I'm I'm a good guy, I'm well educated, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
Like, what makes a when you're saying, hey, is this a good buyer? Like, what makes a good buyer? And do you think that maybe a seller's evaluation of a good buyer is the same as a broker's evaluation of a good buyer, for example?
Um, Not sure, you know, what if there's complete alignment between
Hmm.
the seller and the broker. Broker may just want to get a transaction and get a fee and be done with it. Um, um, so no, but I think I've known lots of brokers over the years, and the ones I've known tend to definitely try to help their clients. So, but there's always bad apples. So, um, yeah, I would just, I think that having a good broker is probably worth it versus trying to do it on your own. As for myself, I try to do it always on my own to save money. So I probably should have gone with a broker or some type of advisor. So yeah, I think you know with uh, yeah. So okay, so the original, I think I did in a roundabout.
Sorry, I asked kind of a double
There's
question.
kind of double question there.
That's on me as the host.
Yeah,
I'm sorry about that.
yeah.
Sort of first, what in the seller's opinion makes a good buyer?
Oh, the good buyer.
And
Yeah,
then, is the seller's evaluation and the broker's evaluation of the buyer's quality the same?
yeah. So what makes a good buyer? So I've sold companies to publicly traded companies and private companies. I've never sold it to a fund.
Mm,
Um, so now I have friends that have sold their businesses to funds, but I've never personally done that. You know, if you're getting a check and that's it, then that makes it really easy.
yeah.
Um, and and if you're not going to be around for a while, you're not going to be around the business you're basically going to be exited. Then that's about simple as it gets, and it's just that matters is who has the better cash deal, I guess. But if it's uh, but a lot of businesses there are it's usually they may, especially the smaller ones, it's more about they'll maybe some type of down payment, and then you know it'll be paid over time. A lot of that's out of the cash flow to the business, so it's kind of self financing the transaction. um so in that kind of structure, the buyer, you really definitely want to have a good buyer because you want to make sure that they pay you. And there are instances where maybe they don't run the business very well and they don't pay, or there's disputes and so forth. So um, it's a tough one. Uh,
So if you have two buyers, and I'm gonna throw a hypothetical at you, you can pass on it if you prefer.
yeah,
Two buyers come to the table. They both have the same amount of cash.
yeah.
They're both, 10% down SBA loan structure. What would be the differentiating factor between two buyers that, sort of seem financially similar? Are there other factors that you're thinking about as you're evaluating those buyers?
Since this is dependent upon you know me getting paid over time,
Hmm.
and most likely that is dependent upon the success of the company. I want someone who I think it would be the best operator of that
Hmm.
company and can do the best, with that. And so if it's someone who, you know, if it's someone who has got experience running a business in that type of business, that's the best. Um, but sometimes it's people who've been an executive for a long time, and they want to do something different. They've always wanted to own their own business. It
Hmm.
doesn't necessarily make them a great operator.
Right.
If I were, executive, I might have a personal assistant, and you know, the business is, bigger, and they operate differently. So, um, you know, it's tough because it's hard to figure out what skills really translate when it comes to running a smaller business. Um, and sometimes it just doesn't work out, and
Yeah.
they're kind of this is they thought this looked great on paper, and then they get into the saddle and realize it's a lot tougher than they thought it would be.
Mm.
So um so yeah, I mean, at that point it's really due diligence on it's reverse due diligence. It's due diligence on the buyer, and your it's kind of the intuition that you have about who's the best person that's going to manage and run this company going forward, and make sure that the value is still there and you get paid.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Any stories from your time working with buyers and sellers at BizEquity that people might find interesting? I'm keeping this really open ended
Yeah.
because I know you interacted with a ton of people kind of at the peak pressure moments of their
Yeah.
business careers. I'm curious if anything really stood out to you.
Well, so when I started the company in 2007, and you know what came in at
Yeah,
2008?
I was gonna say that's kind of a yeah
Yeah.
close to
So
major events maybe.
so on our website, we and our valuations were free. It was actually a pretty good deal. You could get pretty sophisticated valuation for free at that time. I don't think that's the case anymore. But what happened was, so we would have on our form, we would say, uh, what's your opinion about the prospects of the business? And
Mm,
in 2007, it was always high. It was always very optimistic. Things are going to be great. And then in 2008, virtually no one had a positive,
mm,
um, opinion about their business. And some of it, we had a thing where we can make comments, and they go, I don't even know if I'll be able to survive in the next 6 months. It was like a tsunami was hit. And, we were focused on smaller businesses. And so, in those types of situations where you have a major economic downturn, it's the small businesses that get hit. And there was a little bit of the canary in the coal mine, because we started seeing this, even though the economy wasn't necessarily, the economy was slowing down, but
mm,
not that much. But from our data, we could already tell that things were going sideways quickly. Um, so, so yeah, so I think that was kind of one of the big eye openers about how fast things can change in a market, and how valuations can be drastically impacted because of the macro economy, and that is particularly the case when it comes to smaller businesses. So um, yeah, um, but yeah, I think yeah, we didn't really talk to our customers.
mm,
So they would come to our website and give us tons of information. This was the other thing too. I mean, it's kind of wild. Um, they would come to our website and give us tons of information about their sales and profits and all kinds of things about their business. So they were willing to provide this information where, I would think in some cases they might not be willing to give to other people.
mm.
So, so that was kind of our idea, was that, you know, the the data that we were collecting would be valuable, in and of itself as a way. And we were even looking at ways of, at that time it wasn't really AI, it was machine learning, how we could use that in a way to help build a better product for our customers. But it was still it was very early. But it was really interesting to see that business owners were willing to provide a lot of information online to a website at that time.
Fascinating. And fascinating you had to look at that leading indicator in the buy in the seller comments too.
Yeah,
That's I guess it sort of potentially gives some credence to some of these like consumer sentiment polls and things like that. People, maybe have a good feeling for, especially if it's sentiment based on their own work, not necessarily
yeah,
just sentiment about the climate. That's really interesting.
yeah,
And some lessons for the way those questions are worded.
definitely.
After your experience in multiple M&A transactions, you wrote a book
Yeah,
about the process. So, as someone who I write, but I don't write in any amount of volume or really willingly in any volume. I'm just very impressed by people who can write a lot of words and be very just do a really good job explaining something in so much depth. Like, what inspired you to write the book?
Yeah.
And maybe let's I two-part question, but we'll ask that part one first. What inspired you to write the book?
I'll forget it.
I'm the king of the six-part question, so let's.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm doing my best to. I'm
yeah,
leveling up here. We'll do
yeah,
one part at a time.
yeah. Yeah. So the Complete M&A Handbook, I wrote it, I guess, year 2000, 2001, in that time period. Definitely a very tumultuous time in the history of the of technology. Um, because we went from the, the the boom and bust and the dot coms at that time. Um, the reason I wanted to write that book was I had gone, like you said, I had gone through different transactions, and I learned a lot along the way. And I thought, and I talked to entrepreneurs over the years about their experiences, or they would ask me for my advice, and I just thought, maybe this would be a good topic to write about because of that. And um, you know, before then I had written some other books, and so I went to the publisher and I pitched it, and they liked the idea. Um, and the idea here also was that it wasn't going to only be from my perspective, but from the buyers as well. So it was called the Complete M&A Handbook. So if you were only going to talk about sellers, it would
Right.
not be very complete. So you know, but I think what's interesting is that um, I mean, it's not like I've read it recently, but I pretty much still know what's in that book, and I don't think a lot has changed with
Mm.
M&A over that period. Now, there's different, you know, online systems and taxes are different, things like that. But I think the general principles are still intact and remain valid today. And M&A has been around for a long, long, long decades and decades. So I think a lot of the same principles still apply. So.
Any revisions you would make if you were to write a sequel?
Yeah, if I were to write a sequel, definitely update it for the taxes, and there would be definitely as more about online.
Mm.
I had some of it, but not a lot. Um, so like the value, like the valuation systems, the marketplaces, like that you have. Um, you know, even LinkedIn, how to use something like LinkedIn and or data rooms, how do you set up a data room and what does that include and why do you need one? So I think, it'd be more of the digital side of things that I would probably make most of the updates. But, in terms of negotiation or even valuation, the process, all those kinds of things, I think would, maybe I update some of the stories and
Yeah,
some of the use cases. But for the most part, I don't think there'd be a lot of changes there.
very cool. Um, I'd like to open it up to the audience. So I have a couple more questions for Tom,
Okay.
but while I ask those questions, please put your questions in the chat. That's whatever platform you're using to stream this conversation, we have access to it. So please feel free to put your questions in. And I will jump into my next question while we see if we have anyone on the line that wants to ask you something.
Okay.
Um, so obviously we've been talking about kind of like the timeline of different eras of the M&A space. We have kind of the 2000 2001 timeframe, the 07 08 timeframe we were talking about. Now we're just entering 2024. What are you looking forward to in 2024 when it comes to the acquisition space, and what do you see coming down the pipeline for the search world?
Yeah. So, I would say that the past few years have been challenging for more of the bigger deals. Interest rates going up, the uncertainty with the economy. We had the kind of the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. So a lot of those things, and then we had market volatility too. That makes it difficult, uh, for pricing of these deals. So there's definitely been the past couple of years has seen a big drop in M&A activity. Um, but I think that's going to change, and you're already seeing more deals being, just or even the beginning of the year, we've seen some pretty big deals get announced in the tech sector. There's an oil deal today with Chesapeake. Um, so it's not just technology. So I think there's just a lot of private equity firms out there that have to do deals. I mean, you just can't sit on money and
Right.
wait for a better day. You eventually got to do something. So I think there's a lot of pent up interest in getting deals done, and I think from both buyers and sellers. So I think there's a lot of interest right now. In terms of search funds, um, and some of the smaller deals, um, I think I think the same applies. I mean, the economy is seems to be holding in there, and interest rates are stabilized, if not coming down. Um, and I think there are deals out there too. So I think from a buyer standpoint, there's deals, and I know there's demographic considerations too, as business owners get older and they kind of get tired of running their businesses and they want to retire. I think that's a big trend. So, um, and we're going to see more of that in the years ahead. So, I think part of that's just going to force deal making to happen. So,
Yeah.
I think pretty positive. Next, going forward, I think is pretty positive.
Yeah, it feels like, there's a view of the world where, if the Fed starts cutting interest rates a little bit at the start of the year, the need to deploy some of this dry powder might result in a flurry of activity as long as the economy stays stable.
Yeah,
So kind of like, we talk a little, the government and, online, we talk a lot about a soft landing. There's
yeah,
kind of this like thread the needle of like interest rates on one side, meaningful economy, allowing these businesses to stay afloat on the other. Feels like, if we end up actually doing it, that there could be a really good year for M&A would be the hope. I mean, certainly that would
yeah,
be good for my business,
yeah,
right?
that's right. Yeah, no,
So,
I think that's the consensus right now. And then again, Chesapeake deal today, the ANSYS
oh, we might have had
is getting done, and
hmm.
Hewlett Packard Enterprises is buying Juniper Networks for a big number. So all in all, it's getting off to. Oh,
Yeah, looks like we have
I
a
think I lost
couple of small connectivity issues.
you. That's
There we go.
right.
There you go. We had a little connectivity
Or-
issue there. Okay,
Okay, I
very
think we're
cool.
back.
All right. Well, I think we're back. Yes.
Yeah,
I have one more question for Tom. So, one last chance to put your questions into the chat. I'm going to ask this question, and then if there's nothing in the chat, we're going to close things out. This is kind of more personal question on my end. As a serial entrepreneur, as an author, you've pursued ventures and written books in a number of different arenas. AI, business, investing, computing. Just curious, for someone who's so well-rounded, can you talk a little bit about your entrepreneurial process? Like, what inspires you to get into an industry, and what is typically your signal that it's time for you to move on to the next one?
Hmm. I think when I started my first, and I think this my thought process is pretty much the same since then. You know, when I started my first business, which was exam preparation, so it was Windows software. It was actually on CD back in the early '90s to help help students with exams for like CFA or
Mm-hmm.
CPA, those types of real estate exam, all those kinds of exams. So, um, and
I will
in the
say that my signal to get out of finance is when I had to start
yeah,
CFA. So
well, the
I
CFA
joke,
is a pretty tough exam.
but
Um, the What I found at that time was that I was fairly much a good student, but I was terrible at exams,
Hmm.
um, especially kind of like LSAT type or SAT. For whatever reason, I just never was good at it. And I know other people are not necessarily good at that. So I knew that there was. So I personally experienced the problem, And I think that's the thing. I feel like if you're going to build a business and spend all this time building a business, I do think it helps if you have firsthand experience with the problem that your customers are facing.
Mm.
You know, I think you have a better perspective on things, and you understand what the pain is, and you're motivated to solve it, primarily just to solve your own pain. So, um, you know, that's how I looked at it. Uh, and valuation was kind of, BizEquity was kind of the same thing. It's like, you know, how do I create you need these valuations, but it's not that easy to put one of these things together.
Right.
How can you make it much easier to put these together? And sometimes you don't need to get the full on valuation. Sometimes you just want to get an idea what the value of the business
Yeah.
is. But I don't want to have to learn how to do all that. And how can I do that in a way that's a lot easier?
Oh, there we might have had another freeze there. Sorry about that, everybody.
Lost contact again. So in firsthand as to when to get out of a business. Sometimes it's I think the market for me it's how well the other thing too with me is I usually have had a partner
Mm.
and I don't want to be CEO. This is not my skill set. So I'd like to have a partner who likes to be the CEO. And then what usually happens over time, I kind of get bored and I look for another opportunity. So it's not necessarily that I think, maybe that there's no opportunity left in that business, but I like being part of the early stages of it,
Mm.
creating the business, getting it launched, and then bringing some people in there to make it to carry on. But I'm not the kind of person who likes to just be part of a organization,
Mm.
like like a it almost feels like a real job or it's
Yeah. Like once you build the organization around you, you're part of a corporation again, and it's not what you ever wanted.
exactly got all these meetings and all this stuff. And it's not interesting anymore. So I think it's not necessarily that I don't believe in the business. I think it's just that there's a certain part of where I think I'm best at, and I really like pursuing and focusing on, and there are other parts I don't. And that's why I always think that this concept that founder-led businesses are somehow the best businesses ever, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. Now,
Mm.
clearly someone like Bill Gates, who's a phenomenal person who created the business and wound up being able, or Michael Dell, same way, can be a super entrepreneur, but also manage a complicated global organization with tens of thousands of employees and billions of dollars in revenue. Um, but I don't think a lot of people are really good at that. I think they're good. There are people that are really good at starting things and building businesses and at to a certain point, and then there are the operators. And I know a lot of operators who they would not be terrible at starting a business,
Mm.
but God, they can just be so good at growing the business and making it into a much larger business. So, um, I think you got to be honest about what your capabilities are and your skill sets and know kind of your limitations. And for me, a lot of times it's like if I feel like I don't want to do it anymore, I don't want to show up, or you know, I'm not excited about it anymore. That's the clear sign. It's time for me to think about something else and moving on.
Yeah. Makes sense. Well, if you're listening to this and you say to yourself, "Well, I don't know if I want to keep doing my job," maybe buying a business is for you. That's
That's true.
a little plug for the industry, and for Private Market Labs, anything we can do to help you. Anyway, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been
Yeah,
fantastic. I certainly learned a ton. I know our listeners, viewers will have gotten a ton out of this. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, search Funder, on X or on LinkedIn, please like, subscribe, give us a review, give us a like or a subscribe on Spotify. We're on all these platforms, so I'm trying to remember list everything out appropriately. But yes, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining in, and y'all have a good day.